I think we can get started now. So hello and welcome to our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the world. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychoanalysis, Psychiatry, and Psychology. We are thrilled to have so many guests joining us from countries around the globe and states across the United States. We would like to extend a special welcome to our participants today from Poland, Portugal, Spain, UK, Morocco, Ireland, Canada, Japan, Cyprus, Grenada, Belgrade, South Korea, Ukraine, and Bulgaria. To all of you, a very special welcome. Thank you to all who included questions for our speakers when you registered. If you would like to add questions for our speakers today, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible. Thank you. So today we turn our attention to the history of slavery and emancipation in the British Empire. The topic of our talk today is Slave Empire: How Slavery Built Modern Britain. We are very pleased to welcome our guest speakers, Professor Padraic Scanlan and Professor Michelle Stevens. Padraic Scanlan joins us today from Canada. He is Assistant Professor in the Center for Industrial Relations and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Freedom's Debtors, British Anti-Slavery in Sierra Leone in the Age of Revolution, and Slave Empire: How Slavery Built Modern Britain. He is writing The Irish Question: A History of Labor in the Area of the Irish Great Famine, to be published by Robinson and Basic Books. Our moderator today is Professor Michelle Stevens, a psychoanalyst and professor of English and Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers University, and the founding and executive director of Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. Originally from Jamaica, West Indies, she graduated from Yale University with a Ph.D. in American Studies. She is the author of Black Empire: The Masculine Global Imaginary of Caribbean Intellectuals in the United States, 1914 to 1962. And Skin Acts: Race, Psychoanalysis, and the Black Male Performer. Recently, she published articles on the intersections of race and psychoanalysis in several journals, including the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and Psychoanalytic Quarterly, Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society. So without any further from me, welcome Padraic Scanlan and Michelle Stevens.
Okay, so do you want to go ahead, Michelle, or shall I?
You can jump right in. No,
okay.
No, go ahead. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much, Professor Stevens, for moderating this panel. Thanks very much for the invitation. So I think our plan today is I just have a sort of a short presentation that'll give you a sense of the overall argument. Managed to find a hardcover copy of my book, Slave Empire, that'll sort of set the table for our discussion. But please, if any questions occur to you, please put them in the chat. I'm sure the conversation will go far beyond the bounds of the presentation. But for now, let me introduce you to the core arguments of my book. Oh, there's my children. So, rather than my book. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I want to start by thinking today about the meaning of freedom in the British Empire. That's the real theme of this presentation. So, in the present, especially now in the era after Brexit, I think there's been a real reckoning in Britain with the relationship between contemporary Britain and the British Empire, and especially between contemporary Britain and the legacies of transatlantic slavery and anti-slavery in the British world. So freedom and liberty have become, in a sense, I think, watchwords for apologists for British imperialism. Although I think even the most sort of strident imperial apologist in the present would acknowledge Britain's crucial role in the formation of the transatlantic slave trade and in the elaboration of mass enslavement in the Caribbean, British anti-slavery has become, at least for certain parts of the British commentariat, a way of excusing the British Empire and sort of pointing to the essential virtue of British imperialism. So although British imperialism was brutal, in the 18th century, anti-slavery and the spread of a particular kind of British freedom in the 19th century is taken by some as a way of exculpating the British Empire and of sort of comparing the British Empire and the legacies of British imperialism to the legacies of other European imperialisms. So that word freedom, I think, does an awful lot of work for imperial apologetics. And indeed, as you'll see, it did an awful lot of work in the 19th century as well. But it's often unconsidered and undefined. So my interest today is trying to work out briefly through the lens of the arguments of my book, what freedom meant in the 19th century British Empire and what it meant for the anti-slavery movement, and to kind of inject some skepticism into triumphalist narratives of the rise of British anti-slavery. So my book, Slave Empire, is a history of the rise and fall of slavery in the British Empire. It's particularly a history of the rise of anti-slavery. And I emphasize throughout the book the relationship between an empire of the 18th century built through mass enslavement and an empire of the 19th century that was ostensibly devoted to spreading free labor and free trade in the name of British imperialism, but was in fact built on the structures constructed in the 18th century by mass enslavement. So I want to start with a material fact. Slavery was an absolute cornerstone of Atlantic empire in the British world in the 18th century. So Britain abolished its slave trade in 1807 and abolished plantation slavery in most of its colonial empire in 1833. But Britain remained closely connected to slavery, despite its anti-slavery politics, through the trading connections that it had made in the era before abolition, and through the profound dependence of British industrial capitalism on raw materials produced by enslaved laborers, especially in the United States, but also in Brazil and Cuba in the course of the 19th century. But I also want to think about more subtle ideas that were also made in the era of slavery about what it meant to be civilized, right? This key concept for 19th century British imperialists was the idea that the British Empire was spreading civilization around the globe. So today I want to think a little bit about the roots of that concept of civilization and show some of the ways that civilization, this ostensibly like libertarian idea about free labor and free trade, was in fact rooted in the legacies of slavery. So here's an image published very shortly after the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807. And I think it illustrates some very familiar sentiments from anti-slavery commentators working at that period in British history. You can see here the seated figure of Britannia surrounded by recently emancipated enslaved people. And you can see Britannia seated on the throne, Britain presented as a kind of lawgiver, as a giver of freedom, as a figure of beneficence that inspires gratitude in the people to whom she offers, from the people to whom she offers her blessings. So I think that was the image of anti-slavery that anti-slavery activists wanted to emphasize for the legacies of their movement within British history. And it's also a position that they believe their movement embodied, this image of open-handed humanitarianism, of teaching and educating recently emancipated people. But I want to turn back the clock a little bit to a very famous novel, a kind of classic adventure story of the British 18th century, which is Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. So you probably, I'm sure everybody in attendance knows at least the core of the plot, right? Robinson Crusoe shipwrecked in the Caribbean, left alone on an island. He meets a man whom he names Friday, who becomes his servant. He then escapes from the island. He builds this kind of settled life on a desert island and eventually escapes. So that's the familiar part of Robinson Crusoe. But I want to emphasize that the story of Robinson Crusoe is actually bracketed by two stories about transatlantic slavery. So the story begins with Robinson Crusoe investing in a transatlantic slave voyage, and then with Crusoe being captured off the coast of Europe and enslaved himself by Barbary corsairs, and then escaping from slavery in North Africa, effectively by selling selling a young boy who helps him escape on board named Shuri, whom he then effectively barters. He barters Shuri's continued kind of like penal servitude on board a galley ship in exchange for an escape. And it's that escape that leads Crusoe to being shipwrecked in the Caribbean. And then after, when Crusoe escapes from the desert island at the end of the novel, he returns to Europe, where he becomes a rich man because he's able to sell the plantations that he had purchased in Brazil, plantations worked by enslaved laborers. And that, so the story has this key, the kind of story of survival on a desert island, on a deserted island, is bracketed by two stories about transatlantic slavery. And actually the timeline within the kind of fictional timeline within the novel speaks to the rise of an acceleration of British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and in plantation slavery. So within the novel in 1651, Robinson Crusoe signs up as a crew member on a slave ship. In 1654, he escapes from Barbary corsairs. And meanwhile, 1 year after the fictional events of Robinson Crusoe, England conquers Jamaica. The New Model Army takes Jamaica from Spain, establishing Britain's largest and most profitable plantation colony in the process. And then again, in the novel, Crusoe, leaving from Brazil, plans to skirt the Asiento slave trade monopoly. So Crusoe is involved in trying to avoid the monopoly that the Spanish government had established on importing enslaved people to Spanish colonies. He's shipwrecked in 1659. He escapes from the island in 1686. And then in 1688, Britain is transformed by the Glorious Revolution, which many historians take as really the moment when Britain's involvement in the slave trade accelerated. And many historians also take it as the moment when Britain's hold on its Caribbean colonies was consolidated. So the fictional timeline of Robinson Crusoe happens to take place at the exact moment that Britain happened to be building up its relationship to slavery. Moreover, the book was published at a moment in 1719 when Britain's Atlantic trade was a growing source of prosperity, that was catalyzed by mass enslavement. As you can see here from these images, right? These are images that depict the rate of enslaved people crossing the Atlantic Ocean from West Africa to the Americas in the course of the 18th century on British ships. So you can see a sort of relentless rise in the transatlantic slave trade, interrupted only by the blockade imposed by French and American ships during the American Revolution, right on the eve of the transatlantic slave trade, of the end of the transatlantic slave trade in Britain. The novel was also published as Whig propaganda. So Defoe was a prolific writer, and he was profoundly connected to the Whig interest, right? The interest of Parliament over the king. And the Whig interest, above all, believed in freedom. But what they meant by freedom was security of property and protection from the crown. So it was freedom from interference. And so when Robinson Crusoe becomes, in a sense, a kind of petty landowner and a master of at least one servant on his all but abandoned island in the Caribbean, he is participating in a particular kind of a particular understanding of British freedom that flows from the exercise of mastery over others, and that flows from the dependence of others on the ostensibly free person. So to be free in the 18th century British Empire was to own land. To be free in the British Empire was to be relied upon by others for sustenance, for support. And so in a sense, in the 18th century British Empire, claiming to own enslaved people as property was a part of the British understanding of political freedom. And I think that continuity, that connection between slavery and freedom, that's kind of essential union of the two concepts, which are ostensibly sort of starkly divided from one another, is essential to understanding the later legacies of anti-slavery in the empire. So some readers have read Robinson Crusoe for adventure, but they forget that it also offered a lesson. It offered a lesson in how captivity, a form of captivity on a desert island, became a form of liberty. Exploration, exploitation, self-discipline, and the mastery of land were all ways that Crusoe, although he was captured by the borders of the island where he had washed up after a shipwreck, became in a sense a freer man despite being in captivity. And then when he meets the man whom he names Friday and takes as his servant, Crusoe becomes still more free through the exercise of mastery over others. Friday in the novel is called a cannibal, and consequently he takes license. He lives an unrestrained life, but Crusoe teaches him to master himself, and Friday in the novel loves him for it. So Friday is not enslaved in Robinson Crusoe, but it's hard not to see the ways that a growing empire based on mastery could cross-pollinate into all kinds of other ideas about British political life. So this idea of the desert island and the lone kind of common Englishman conquering and transforming the world becomes an evergreen theme in the era of British imperialism. And it becomes, I think, a kind of imaginative space for allegories and fantasies and moral lessons about imperialism. What you see on the screen here are, in fact, 4 obviously unauthorized sequels to Robinson Crusoe that explore the idea of making a political society or making a British citizenship or British subjecthood on a desert island in different ways. So you can see one is about Robinson Crusoe and fiscal policy. One is about Robinson Crusoe as from a kind of looking at the legacies of the people whom Robinson Crusoe maroons on his island at the end of the book. And then you can see kind of new versions of Robinson Crusoe on the right-hand side of the screen, one of which depicts Robinson Crusoe as a kind of scholar, and then another which shows Robinson Crusoe as a kind of proto-Christian missionary, right? You can see a crucifix in the bottom left-hand corner. So this idea of making mastery and making land and making control over space was closely connected, I think, to the ideology of British rule in the 18th century. So this is an image of probably the most famous British abolitionist in the historical record. It's an unfinished portrait of William Wilberforce. It's one of my favorite portraits of Wilberforce. I really like the way that the painted part of the portrait kind of pops from the cartoon in the background. It's from the National Portrait Gallery. And it's just a sketch, much like my discussion of Robinson Crusoe is just a sketch. But I think it still suggests something about the man. And so I want to think about some of the overarching arguments of the book, and I'd be happy to explore them in much greater depth in the Q&A. So I want to make a couple of points. First of all, I argue in Slave Empire that freedom in the British Empire in the 18th century was entangled ideologically as well as materially with slavery. So I think we've seen that ideologically in the case of Robinson Crusoe, the ways that ideas about control and mastery and the way that mastery confers freedom were crucial to the ideology of British imperialism. And I think just the material fact of British commerce in the 18th century, centered as it was on the sugar-producing islands of the Caribbean, which were worked almost entirely by enslaved labor, right? The centrality of the Caribbean to 18th century British commerce made the material roots of the British Empire profoundly connected to slavery, even as ideas about land and mastery made the ideological roots of British imperialism also closely connected to slavery. So Robinson Crusoe is a thriller, right? It's still read today. It's still pretty good. One of the, it still is a good adventure story, but it's also a parable about what it meant to most Britons to be free and civilized. So it was extremely popular in its time, both because it's a good adventure story, but also because it said something very meaningful to a lot of British readers about what freedom was. And one of the features of freedom, common to both the era of slavery and the era of anti-slavery, was the idea that freedom has degrees and that it requires certain kinds of markers of status and kinds of behavior to secure itself. So Crusoe becomes free by exercising mastery. That was an idea that even William Wilberforce carried forward into the 19th century when he argued that the process of emancipating enslaved people ought to be as gradual as possible, and that the actual moment of emancipation ought to be not a moment of when formerly enslaved people would come into political and economic rights, the same as any other British subject, but rather Wilberforce conceived of the moment of emancipation as a moment as the beginning of a much longer journey towards full participation in freedom. And so, one of the things that I explore in the book is the settlement in 1833 that abolished slavery in the British Empire, a settlement that required formerly enslaved people to continue to work for either 4 or 6 years without wages for the people who had once claimed to own them under a program called apprenticeship. And also, the same bill included a £20 million compensation fund, which was paid out to former slaveholders rather than to formerly enslaved people to compensate them for their putatively lost property, right? So, and I think there has been a tendency among some historians to treat that moment as kind of the victory of the slaveholding interest over the abolitionist interest. But one of the things that I've tried to argue in Slave Empire is that the abolitionist interest was perfectly content with a program of apprenticeship, was perfectly content with a program of compensation, because those programs reflected their abiding belief in the idea that freedom was something that needed to be earned over time, and that emancipation ought to be gradual. And finally, that requires a kind of civilizing process, a set of steps that both make imperial and colonial power possible and justify it. And so I think in the 19th century, anti-slavery helped to provide a lot of the justification for British imperialism, but at the same time was not particularly different, or was not entirely different from the system that preceded it. So I want to just quickly think about emancipation in 1833 really briefly. I've already mentioned some of the structure of emancipation, but it included £20 million in compensation to slaveholders and a period of apprenticeship from 1834 to 1838. Formerly enslaved people were divided into 2 categories, predial and non-predial. And predial referred to enslaved people who had worked on plantations as agricultural laborers, and non-predial referred to enslaved people who had worked in skilled trades or as domestic servants during the period of slavery. And that distinction of predial and non-predial was taken from medieval Scottish law to divide enserfed and non-enserfed people. That was where it was resurrected from Scottish law. And it reflects, I think, a core idea of the anti-slavery interest, which was that enslaved people were, temporally speaking, they were kind of in a different temporality than people in Britain. They needed to be brought into the modern world before they could be allowed to enjoy the full fruits of freedom. But of course, and I'm happy to talk more about emancipation in the Q&A. I don't want to get too bogged down. I'm afraid to say I know the details really well, which can be a blessing and a curse. So I'll set them aside for the moment and just kind of summarize some of the other arguments of the book. After emancipation, the transatlantic slave trade continued. In fact, it continued in almost as substantial a volume as before the abolition of the British slave trade. Enslaved people, however, tended to go to Brazil or Cuba rather than to the islands of the Caribbean or the American coast. But transatlantic slave trade was not stopped by the abolition of the British slave trade. And in the 19th century, British industry and British finance came to dominate global trade, and global trade remained closely tied to the production of raw materials by enslaved people, whether it was sugar or coffee among enslaved people in Brazil or Cuba, or crucially to the British economy, cotton produced by enslaved people in the United States. So Britain remained at the center of an economy focused on slavery, even as anti-slavery allowed it to claim new territory in the name of freedom and the British anti-slavery empire. And so that brings me to the question of anti-slavery and empire, right? The end of slavery in the British Empire was an impressive achievement, but I would emphasize it wasn't only a British achievement, and I'm happy to talk about this as well. Enslaved people put abolition on the agenda in Parliament, although the acts that emerged from Parliament looked nothing like the kind of freedom that enslaved people were demanding in the Caribbean. So while revolts by enslaved people, resistance by enslaved people affected the British legislative agenda, in the end, they didn't affect the content of British legislation in a way that was particularly satisfying when emancipation came. So I think many one of the things I relate in the book is the wave of quite often very violent protests to the apprenticeship program among formerly enslaved people in 1834, because they simply could not understand that freedom meant 4 more years of doing exactly the same job that they had done while they were enslaved for no money. Right. And so there was a lot of conflict that was stopped in the end by military force to impose apprenticeship. And so I try to draw this through line from Robinson Crusoe through to apprenticeship, this common thread of civilization earned through mastery and earned through self-mastery, and civilization as something that could be taught or imposed. But finally, anti-slavery directly influenced the growth of empire, especially in West and Central Africa. So there were many British colonies in the later 19th century in West Africa that were claimed in the name of anti-slavery. But anti-slavery was also an all-purpose justification for empire, because the abolition of slavery came to be taken as proof of British virtue. So finally, there was, I'll skip, sorry, I've got a few, okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I accidentally blocked the last slide. So finally, I want to emphasize right there was no bright line between the brutality of plantation labor under slavery and the civilization that the empire promised to its subjects. Anti-slavery laws and policies dissolved colonial slavery, at least in the Caribbean, but at the same time, they preserved white supremacy. And that wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. It was part of the design of the policy from London. And as freedom, free elections, free labor, free trade became the watchwords of the Victorian era, the British Empire was still sustained by the labor of enslaved people in the United States in particular, but also in Cuba, Brazil, and elsewhere. And one of the things I explore in the book is the ways that modern Britain has inherited the legacies and contradictions of this liberal empire, this empire devoted to spreading liberty, that was nonetheless built materially and ideologically on slavery. And I argue that modern industrial capitalism and modern liberalism emphasize freedom for individuals and markets, but their roots in the material and ideological fact of human bondage are often obscure, but are really, really crucial to examine and to explore. So I really am looking forward to conversation about any of these ideas and more. So thank you very much.
Patrick, thank you so much, both for your book in and of itself and for your presentation to us about this. I actually wanted to highlight a couple of things that I think are important first before kind of engaging you in a conversation about it a little bit before we turn to questions from everyone who has joined us this morning. I want to emphasize right off the bat to everyone watching and listening how much I appreciated the linking right where you just ended in your presentation, the linking of anti-slavery and freedom to racism, right? Or to what we think about as the racialization of our political and economic policies by racial capitalism as it originates out of slavery, right? And the kind of slave empire. I'm stressing that as a kind of first overall point because I think in contemporary discussions, when we try to think about race relations in the United States, they can get a bit bogged down in the question of, is this a kind of specific American condition? And I know we have people from all over the world with us at this moment, listening in and watching. And what I appreciated about your argument and the history that you tell is you really make visible the global implications and impact of the British slave empire, right? So it's not just British, it's not just in the Caribbean. It obviously is a field of activity, economic activity over time and space that the US is a part of, right? And so that's kind of like the first thing that I want to emphasize and see your further comments on, which is this as a global phenomenon, as a global structure. And I think that might help as one of the first things I think that could help with some of the discussions in the US that sometimes get a bit bogged down as if the issues of race that we deal with in the US have a kind of exceptionalist US feel, right? So I think I'll make my comments first just to kind of put a few things out there and then see what you want to pick up and respond to. The second thing that I find really powerful about your argument is in the same way that counterintuitively, you're disrupting the narrative that we're moving from slavery to anti-slavery, and this means a kind of redemption of the British Empire, a kind of recuperation of the British Empire. And then you go in such, exquisite, eloquent, and very, very straightforward detail into the links. Like, there's a way you provide a real tracing of the links between anti-slavery and the slave empire itself, right? I think these pose interesting questions for us about thinking about the different forms that anti-racism, which is kind of our contemporary discourse, even anti-Black racism. I think there's a parallel kind of thing to think about, whether certain liberal discourses of anti-Black racism may be a little bit more interconnected with liberal and older policies of racism than maybe we'd like to believe. We want to think of these things as if they are on opposite sides of a political spectrum or of a progressive agenda. And I'm curious whether thinking a little bit about anti-racism in ways not unlike how you're following and tracking anti-slavery might be useful for us. So I wanted to put that out as a second, piece. I even want to briefly mention a quote I think that you have in the book. I think I'm quoting you here, where you say that white supremacy actually is framed as a benign, raceless ideal of human flourishing that was justified by new kinds of conquest and domination. I think that idea that white supremacy is actually about ideologies of racelessness was really, really pointedly, helpful, right? I already see that you're nodding, so I have two more points, but I think I'm going to pause and actually, so that you're not like trying to hold on, and just see already, because I can tell you already have thoughts about some of what I'm saying. So maybe I'll pause there and see just kind of what, how your, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I just would like to elaborate a little bit on that phrase, white supremacy, because I think one of the things that I found in researching the book, right, is that at least in print, the phrase white supremacy is first used in discussions of the post-emancipation Caribbean after the Haitian Revolution, right? So I think one of the things, and I think the Haitian Revolution actually highlights a lot of the complexity of and sometimes sort of obliviousness of at least mainline like white British anti-slavery thinking, because so the Haitian Revolution was an incredible achievement for Black freedom, but it was not interpreted as such in England, right? It was seen as a kind of French failure rather than a Haitian success, right? So it was, I think most people in Britain were sympathetic to enslaved rebels and then free, like self-emancipated rebels in Haiti, but they were also deeply hostile to France. Of course, they were at war with, and so they blamed the Haitian Revolution not on slavery as such, but on French greed, right? So France had imported too many enslaved people to what was then the colony of Saint-Domingue, that had completely disrupted the otherwise peaceful sort of labor environment of the plantation. And so France had kind of reaped what it sowed for trying to overproduce sugar on its islands, which was in a way kind of a sort of jealous argument from British planters who were upset that their lands no longer produced sugar as easily or in as substantial yields as in Saint-Domingue. And so there were all of these books written about the Haitian Revolution in the wake of it, one of which, I can't recall the author now, where he first uses, as far as I've been able to find, the first use of the phrase white supremacy in print in a British book, where he's just imagines it as a kind of default position, right? Like it's clear that white supremacy is needs to be preserved, right? He's kind of imagining. So here's post-revolutionary Haiti. He applauds the achievements of Toussaint Louverture and other Haitian revolutionary leaders, but he says in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Guyana, in these colonies, we can maintain white supremacy and think about how much more productive the colonies will be, right? So he's not saying, and it's intended as a form of white supremacy that's benign. The planters are white, but they are rapacious, violent, brutal. They've been as brutalized by claiming to own enslaved people as enslaved people themselves. Replace the whites at the top of the plantation structure with judges, colonial administrators, missionaries, and you'll have a completely different version of the empire, one that maintains the social order with white Britons on top, but which is sort of washed of all of the violence of slavery. So it's treated not as it's treated as an obvious policy goal. It's certainly not a category or an idea that is at all contentious, or it's certainly not something that anti-slavery activists, at least white anti-slavery activists in Britain, argue about. The idea of like who will be in charge in the post-emancipation Caribbean. So I think that's says something about white supremacy as an ideology and as a set of structures, right? As something that's kind of unquestioned and default. And it's not so much white supremacy or equality, it's what kind of white supremacy will there be? Will it be the evil white supremacy of the planters, or will it be a benign white supremacy of colonial administrators?
Yes, I think that's the word. Benign is the word that was resonating for me as you were speaking. I think, again, in our charged contemporary moment, we tend to attach much more violent connotations to the phrase white supremacy, whether violent physically or just violent politically. And what I think is a really helpful corrective, deeply embedded in the history that you have been tracing, is for people to realize that that dichotomy is a little bit too sharp. There's layers, and so even the idea that you can put together benign white supremacy, that's not just a contradiction in terms, I think is useful for us to think about, because the implications of that are still roiling through our policies, our politics, our structures, right? Redlining had violent effects in terms of segregation and housing in the US, but is rooted in a set of policies that at their instigation may have appeared to be benign, right, about where people live, right? So that's just a very complex framing that I think that you're providing, in a very deep history. Do you have thoughts about the second thing that I raised about ways of thinking about anti-racism and anti-slavery, given the kind of subtlety with you are, talking about anti-slavery in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm less sort of well versed in the practice of contemporary anti-slavery or contemporary anti-racism, but I do think there are certain. I think the history of anti-slavery, at least in the British Empire, says something about the capacity of, I guess, a particular kind of liberalism to conceal its own material and ideological foundations. I think that there's a sense in which anti-slavery was useful in the 19th century as an all-purpose justification for almost anything. And it was wielded in all kinds of different ways by all kinds of different people. It was a much more flexible doctrine than perhaps was sort of straight, which might actually analogize to contemporary anti-racism, right? As just, I mean, like racism is a world historically toxic and corrosive set of ideas and practices. To be against it is obvious, right? Slavery was a hugely destructive and equally corrosive and one of the roots of anti-Black racism. To be opposed to slavery is obviously on the face of it, how to whatever anti-slavery is good. And I feel like that justified an awful lot in the 19th century British Empire, and was useful in all kinds of contexts, right? To do all kinds of things that harmed, that created structures of racial domination in the name of anti-slavery.
Yes.
And so that, just as a kind of straightforward example from the book, after apprenticeship in 1838, when finally slavery and apprenticeship finally collapse in the British Empire for good, one of the first things the crown governments do in the Caribbean is raise the price of crown land. And the reason is that formerly enslaved people, especially the kind of most prosperous apprentices, probably had enough money to buy land. And it seems to me, look, I'm not the it's pretty clear to me that there's a pretty sophisticated political ideology and set of political beliefs that enslaved people had, as particularly the leaders of rebellions against slavery. But it's not always, the sources that we have don't always make those politics crystal clear. But as far as I can tell, one of the main political desiderata of enslaved people was to obtain land, because land meant freedom.
Yes.
And it meant freedom, both like just freedom from the market, freedom to become like farmers, or whether tradespeople, like freedom from the plantation. And so it's telling that one of the first one of the first things that the British government does after emancipation is to raise the price of crown land, to make it harder for emancipated people, except for the very wealthiest, to buy land and buy that kind of freedom. And that's not to raise crown revenue. That's by design. That's to make sure that the right kind of people, the kind of people who are have already internalized the values of the market and the values of the empire enough to have made enough money to buy land, will be the people who own land. And I think that was in the name of anti-slavery, and so it was just sort of taken as given. And I think that the power of that rhetoric to just erase its own intentions and roots and genealogy is really potent, and might be something that is something to think about, at least in the contemporary practice of anti-racist politics.
Yes. So you used a phrase that actually segues very nicely to a third thing that I wanted to hear you speak more about. You said freedom to become. And at the time when you said it, you were talking about freedom to become farmers. You were kind of talking about the professional or occupational categories that enslaved peoples might have wanted to inhabit, right? But I wanted to pull out a little bit more what you're also offering, especially for those of us in the audience who are psychoanalytically interested and psychoanalytically inclined. What you're also saying about a kind of freedom to become a certain kind of understanding of the human, right? And I'm going to just use some quotes again, just to kind of help us think about this. One I found, because I think this has a very significant kind of impact for what I might call the psychoanalytic subject, the subject that psychoanalysis thinks that it is treating, right? And so just to kind of use a few of, you talk, for example, about, I love this quote, you say, the leaders of the British anti-slavery campaign were good, well-meaning, middle to upper class white British liberals. They believed in the power of wages to motivate workers and in the innate value of hard work. They favored patriarchal families with a clear division between masculine and feminine worlds, where men were the masters outside in the public sphere and women mistresses of the home. They imagined that what they understood as freedom, the kind of economic and political life enjoyed by people of their class, was freedom in its purest form. They imagined themselves as individual subjects exercising personal choices as consumers, as members of the public, and as Christians, right? That subject, those subjects are partly then the subjects that Freud is a part of and treating and thinking with and thinking about as psychoanalysis begins to emerge in Vienna in the late 19th century, right? And there's another colleague and historian, Elizabeth Dillon, who has actually, made the argument that, that even Freud's account of binary sexual difference has one of its defining conditions, the racial capitalism derived from the transatlantic slavery economic empire. And I feel like your account of that story, it helps us make that connection, because you're saying something about the vision of what it means to be a human that is emerging from these notions of what it means to be free and who gets to be defined as human or not, which is where I thought your discussion of Robinson Crusoe was really interesting. So I wondered if this freedom to become a certain kind of person, if maybe you might want to say a little bit more about that, just to kind of zero us in a little bit on even how we think about the individual and how it might be shaped by this history.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a classic historian's move, but I just to retreat to the archive to try to answer a much broader question. But I think it's interesting to think. So I want to use to try to answer that very deep question. The case of Samuel Sharp, right? Sam Sharp is one of the national heroes of Jamaica. He was the leader of the 1830 rebellion against slavery, which was an
You
incredibly
were
sophisticated.
taking me, by the way, you were taking me back to my Jamaican social studies classes. I was reading through the book because I remember Sham Sharp, Paul Bogle, George Williams.
Yeah.
Names I'm sure you're familiar with, our national heroes. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sam Sharp is fascinating because he was in a sense the only enslaved person who the missionaries in Jamaica acknowledged as being worthy of freedom at emancipation. And so there's actually, I was just sort of flipping through through the book and looking for the section on Sharp. I'm trying to find Samuel Sharp was literate. He was what was called a ranger in the world of Jamaican slavery, which means he was an enslaved person, but who had a substantial amount of freedom and earned wages in addition to the work he was required to do as a condition of slavery. So what rangers did was they would ride from plantation to plantation. So they were often they were enslaved people who were trusted enough by plantation owners to go armed and to ride horses. So Sharp was already, seemed to be, at least to missionaries, because he read and he spoke English, because he was spoke English in a sort of British style, because he was literate, because he was Christian and a Baptist minister. He was considered to be already sort of quite far along the kind of ladder of civilization, quite far along the process of becoming, right, of being a civilized person, is a sense becoming the sort of person who can live in the 19th century without constraint. And so to come into kind of a full humanity requires civilization. And so Sharp, in the historical record among the abolitionists and among the missionaries who attended to him after he had been condemned to die at his execution, treat him as a kind of Christ-like figure, almost as like Christ, right? He's the tallest, most handsome man on the plantation. He is perfectly well spoken. He commands and he clearly was a formidable political organizer, because he organized a secret strike of more than 60,000 people that broke out almost simultaneously at the same time on the same day, at a time when there's no telegraph. This is all done by word of mouth between plantations. So it's a formidable political achievement. But here's the passage I wanted to emphasize. So William Knibb, that's a British missionary. This is right when Sam Sharp is about to be executed in May 1832. And Sharp, from the gallows, according to Knibb, said, quote, "I've sinned against the laws of my country, and by these laws I ought to die. But I cannot see that I have sinned against God. All that I wished was to be free. To enjoy that liberty which I find in the Bible is the birthright of every man." And then Knibb claims that before he died, Sharp gave a final kind of beseech the crowd, which included enslaved people and slaveholders, and to, quote, "follow the white minister who came out to teach you," right? That was Sam Sharp's last word, according to William Knibb, last words. And so in a sense, Sam Sharp was, in a way, the only enslaved person in Jamaica who deserved the freedom that he was fighting for, right? He already acknowledged the authority of white ministers to shape the future of freed people after slavery. He was already fully Christian. He was already a church leader. He was already literate. He had all of these other skills. He hadn't been, there are even some commentators argue that because he had never been a plantation, he had never worked in a field, he had been a ranger basically his entire life as an enslaved worker, that he hadn't been debased by the experience of plantation labor. And because he did odd jobs for wages, he already knew about the discipline of wage work. He was already a person, right? And so when he died, the only person who was fully realized in Jamaica to receive freedom sacrificed himself so that other enslaved people in Jamaica could begin the very long process of coming into civilization. So I think that's a very potent idea of civilization as a form of full personhood.
Yes.
And one that I think that certainly guided British imperial policy throughout the 19th century. The idea that, until Homi Bhabha has that essay Mimicry and Mime, right, where he did like not white, not quite, right? So civilization is a constantly retreating frontier, and people in the British Empire, colonized people who imagine themselves, who have been to Oxford, you know what I mean, who are like colonial administrators themselves, who imagine themselves to be as British and as civilized as it's possible to be, go to Britain and find out that that's not the case, right? And that ultimately race is a barrier to civilization. That, you know, in a way it's sort of tragic, right? That like you think about somebody I worked on in my first book on Sierra Leone, Samuel Crowther was the first Anglican bishop, West African Anglican bishop, right? You know, encountered all kinds of racist abuse in Britain. Even though he was a prince of the church, and was probably perhaps the most famous person from Sierra Leone in the 19th century. And, you know, he believed in civilization, but in the end, civilization stops. And it stops, I think, its borders are the borders of race, I think.
I want to pull out something an implication in what you're saying, and it'll allow us to also talk a little bit more about Robinson Crusoe as I share a kind of something that novel has often made me think about also, and to kind of just dialogue with you a little bit about it. You know, you said that's how you got recognized as a person, right? And this notion, this idea of recognition, there is a psychoanalyst named Octave Manoni, who in the 50s wrote a book on the kind of psychology of colonization and created this concept called the Prospero complex, which he pitted against the Oedipus complex, right? And the idea and the features of this, Robinson Crusoe was one of the characters that he uses to kind of delineate this psychological complex. And it was about the fear and anxiety produced in the colonizer subject when they go to a place that's unfamiliar to them and encounter worlds and people that they don't recognize, and a certain kind of anxiety, you know, develops that requires that they essentially erase these colonial worlds that they're coming to of humans and create imaginary creatures as the representatives, projections, right? And so the Fridays, the juries, the Calibans are at some level, you know, internal objects of the colonial mind, right? But they stem from a certain kind of anxiety about the encounter with, and I just love the way that you just said that, humans who they don't know how to recognize as persons, right? And then, of course, over centuries, whole ideologies get created about who a person is, right? That helps to justify why Robinson Crusoe can feel good about himself, that he, you know, befriends Friday, and that, you know, the accomplishment of their friendship is that Friday can become his servant, right? And there's a great passage in Robinson Crusoe where they first describe his discovery of the footprint on the island and the anxiety that is produced in him at this footprint. He's running around the island. He's terrified. He can't find his feet. And I always think of that passage as prior to the establishment of all of these discourses and ideologies about who a person is, there is the hidden anxiety and fear about what it means to actually encounter difference, right? There is all of that phase of it, right, which we sometimes skip over when we're looking at, you know, the imperialist in the kind of at the height of his powers, right? And so I was interested again in just staying a little bit with this notion of the person, because obviously that's going to be of interest to, you know, our audience. And where things that are kind of psychoanalytically, where anxieties and fears, not just power, but anxieties and fears might be also percolating through this discourse. Hopefully that's not too broad or too distant a question. Okay, good.
I just wanted to quickly address, I was just looking at the Q&A. So it's the first mention of white supremacy as the phrase is in 1824. I just looked it up. It's in a former colonist, someone who lived I think in St. Lucia, but I'm not sure, named T.S. Wynne, who wrote in 1824 in a pamphlet called Emancipation. He wrote, under white supremacy, he warned colonists that the next slave revolt might be too vast to quell, quote, under white supremacy or even among themselves. And then he used the phrase again in 1825 in a pamphlet called The Speedy End to Slavery, where he praised Haiti for its success in, quote, knowledge, civilization, and prosperity without any white supremacy or superintendence, which is a disadvantage our West India colonies need not be subjected to. So imagine, like, if Haiti can prosper without white supremacy, imagine how well the British Caribbean will do with it. Anyway, but yes, in terms of civilization, so I think the idea of, so one of the things I think that marks the later 19th century British Empire is a tremendous anxiety about the security of British civilization and the security of the empire. And that's an anxiety that is economic. It's an anxiety that's political, but it's also an anxiety that's profoundly psychological. I think one of the big shocks of the end of the Victorian era in the South African War, or the Boer War at the end of the 19th century, was the discovery that the average British recruit was 5 inches shorter and 40 pounds lighter than the average South African recruit. And that even with whiteness on their side, like white Britons were just a lot smaller and feebler, and they had worse teeth, they lived shorter lives, like that colonists were physically healthier and possibly also more civilized, right? And that so that there was something decadent or decaying within Britain that was a threat to the security of the empire. And I think that a lot of Victorian anthropology was preoccupied with figuring out what constituted the savage, right? Like what is savage and what is civilized, and sort of finding the borders of those two categories, and then worrying about whether or not Britons might be themselves subject to that kind of slow, I think the Victorians, especially by the later empire, imagined civilization as a kind of, whereas in the Enlightenment, they might have imagined it as something that you could step up, right? And having stepped up, it was very difficult to step back down, right? A society sort of advanced in the true optimistic, although often destructive Enlightenment model, right? That human societies are perfectible and that they don't retreat, right? We're all heading towards some kind of apotheosis. But in the 19th century, I think the vision of civilization was a lot more slippery, right? It was something that you needed to run, and which, there are all kinds of roots of that, the emergence of the awareness of deep time, right? The discovery of hominin fossils, the theory of evolution by natural selection, the imperial wars. It was just a rich kind of brew of reasons why the rise of Victorian anthropology, the arrival of really close examination of the London poor and of impoverished people within Britain and the colonies, and the discovery that the lives of very poor people in London were often extremely perilous, and did not look anything at all like the lives of the middle class. And all of those discoveries, I think, put the Victorians on edge about the security of their civilization. And I think that anxiety was political, but it was also psychological. There were epidemics in the late 19th century, in the 1870s and 1880s of nervousness, right? That was the kind of considered to be the quintessential British malady of the late 19th century, attacks of nerves. And attacks of nerves brought on by a feeling of profound insecurity, a feeling that the world was accelerating, and a feeling like you had to run as fast as you could just to stay in place, which I think says something, right? Like, I think in some ways, like the characteristic psychological complaints, at least, Britain is the context I know best. So I know, for example, in the mid 17th century, which was a very difficult time to be alive in Europe, but ironically not that difficult a time to be alive in Britain, especially in the 1660s and 1670s after the Restoration, compared to Germany, it was a lot more secure. And British, like the characteristic British malady was considered to be melancholy, right? To be depression. And it was brought on, and the cure for it was don't eat so much, right? It was, it was like control your diet. Britain consumes too much, right? And so, and I think that says something about the 17th century empire and its relationship to psychology. And I think the panics of the later 19th century about civilization as a psychological condition that people could fall away from, I think speak to offer some parallels as well.
That's right. We could keep going back and forth, I think, for another hour, but I want to be able to shift now and bring in some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. So I know some have come before and some are coming in now. So I'll ask Maria to help move us through that, just to bring some more voices in.
Okay, yes, I really hate to interrupt this very rich conversation that is going on between the two of you, but it would be good to address some of the questions. I know that you can see them as well, so I don't know if you have a preference of where you'd like to start.
I mean, it might be interesting to hear. I think Gisette Bailey's question links to a couple of others that came in earlier that have the general theme of how do we, there was one person who had asked about, when people don't recognize, like fish don't recognize the water they're swimming in, how do we help people see that this history is a part of the water that we're swimming in? And this one is about, it's more specific to the economic question. How could we help to educate people about moving away from capitalism towards a more socialistic economy? And then, I think there are some questions here about your thoughts or our thoughts about how we somehow convey something about this history that helps people in our current moment, right? So maybe you could say that might be one that we might want to pick up on a little bit, just to bring it into the contemporary. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Padraic.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Again, I'm an historian of Britain and the British Empire, and I live in Canada. I'm Canadian. I think that there's a sense. I think it's raises a question about public history in general and about how to interpret, how to explain historical, like what history does for the public, right? And I think that is an incredibly fraught question, and one that I'm kind of ambivalent about, right? Because on the one hand, I'm skeptical of the idea of history as a repository of usable pasts, because I think that as an historian, my interest is always in trying to understand the past, obviously from a contemporary perspective, and the kinds of questions I ask about the past are influenced by our own political moment and my own politics and my own understanding of where I sit in the world. And I wrote this book is specific to a particular vision of the relationship between race and capital in the British Empire that I've developed over years of teaching and writing about it. But at the same time, I don't think that the history of anti-slavery is I don't want, let me frame it this way. I don't want my students, when I teach them this stuff, to come away thinking that it wasn't an incredibly important achievement to abolish slavery. That is absolutely not what I want to convey from the book. But at the same time, I want to teach students that at the same time, like William Wilberforce is not a hero in the same way, or he was unusual for his time in that he led a campaign to abolish the slave trade, among others, right? He wasn't the only leader, but he was very prominent, and he put his reputation on the line to do it. And that's an achievement. But what he achieved was shaped by the people, by the world that he lived in, right? There's this great line, famous, I mean, I'm obviously not the first person to quote it, but the opening line of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Marx, right? Then, like, man makes his own history, but he does not make it exactly as he chooses. The past weighs on the present like a nightmare, which I think in the German is Albtraum, which is really evocative, like a mountain dream, just like weighing down on the present. And I think that making people aware of the structures that underwrite the world that they live in is useful, but it's hard to make that into a national curriculum, right? It requires it's not a good way of creating history as a set of national myths, or a history as a set of as a bedrock for a kind of shared patriotism that's open to everybody, and that everyone living in a country, every citizen of a country, every person in a country can share in. And so that's a really unsatisfying answer, and I'm not good at that. But my vision of what the past is for is shaped by those beliefs.
I mean, it's interesting. I'll just have one thought about that, which is there is something that is a historical sensibility and a psychoanalytic sensibility kind of shares, it seems to me, which is, it's not that, you're kind of using the past, right, for the issues of the present, right? But it's something more like the idea, there's a psychoanalytic word for it by a theorist named Laplanche, of afterwardsness, right? The idea that we're always embedded in a family, right? You can't, just like you need to understand the complexity of a William Wilberforce, you need to understand the complexity of your father, right? And you can't just like get rid of your father, because even if you are estranged from one, if one is estranged from one's father, that person still existed and influenced your life, right? And so there's something about the going back, not just chucking out the past, in these very, good and bad terms, but understanding the past as something you constantly are trying to make new meaning about, right? And I feel like what you did, for example, in the presentation today of getting us to think about freedom, right? That is an example of how you make new meaning out of the historical facts that have laid there for, they've been there, they happened, but you're like, telling us to kind of like go back and think about those facts from a slightly different angle, right? That makes new meaning that might help us in how we think about ourselves, how we think about freedom, right? Just shake some of that up. It doesn't get rid of how we used to think about freedom. It's like it adds a perspective and slightly shifts it. And so that was one thing I was thinking about in terms of, this very complex question. I think you're right, that there's not an easy answer to how do we get this history into consciousness enough to shape contemporary issues, right?
Look, I mean, I think part of it, in the UK and in the US as well, a lot of that discourse is shaped around public memorials, right, around statuary and plaques and museums and how artifacts from the past are presented in the present. I think that's part of the story. But I think in Toronto, right, there was a push, and it just says something, and I think that's valuable, right? Like I think that changing the kinds of people that a nation chooses to celebrate in statues says something about its politics, says something about who belongs and who doesn't within the country. And I think that's a very meaningful form of really useful form of changing a public narrative about the past. But in Toronto, for example, so a lot of stuff in Toronto is named after Henry Dundas, who was the Secretary of State for the Southern Department at the time when, so for British North America, at the time when the colony of Upper Canada, which became Ontario, was founded. And he was close friends with John Graves Simcoe, another man whose name is all over Toronto and all over Ontario. Now, Dundas, right, in the wake of, I think, as Canada reckons with its own relationship to the empire and its own relationship to slavery, Dundas became a kind of figure, right? Because Dundas was the person who introduced the motion when William Wilberforce in 1792 was about to pass for the first time after raising it 3 consecutive years, a motion, mind you, not a law, but a motion that would commit Britain to, at some point, abolishing its slave trade. At the last second, before the vote was called, all the MPs, and one thing that I found in researching the book, and one thing that's, I think, if you read it, right, you can see that a lot of these decisions happen at 5 a.m, right, after the MPs had been sitting in Parliament since 7 p.m. the night before. So there's all these MPs, you can imagine them like asleep on their hands. And then when it looks like things are coming to a head in Parliament at this time, the MPs all get agitated and start yelling, question, 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 which means vote, we're done with this. And just as the MPs were starting to chant question for Wilberforce, Dundas gets up and adds an amendment. And he says, I want to change the bill. So it said, or the motion to say, abolish the slave trade gradually. And he throws in that word, gradually. And the amendment passes overwhelmingly, and then the motion passes overwhelmingly. And so because of that, and because Dundas was a real sort of hard, like the hard man of William Pitt the Younger's administration, he was definitely William Pitt's colonial hatchet man, right? He did the dirty work and was extremely hostile to anything that might lose Britain colonies. He was hostile to the abolition of the slave trade. But at the same time, a few years earlier, he had defended an enslaved man in Scotland in the case that established under Scots law the principle that had already been established under Somerset and Stuart in English law, that enslaved people in Britain, if they had the means, could sue the people who claimed to own them and become manumitted in England, right? Because England had no laws that regulated slavery. And so it was interpreted by Lord Mansfield that meant that if you sued, you could be free. And Dundas defended an enslaved man in that case. So I'm not trying to say Dundas is an anti-slavery hero, but it does say that like he lived in a world where slavery was considered unseemly and immoral, but was considered to be a necessity for imperial security. And that's the world that Dundas came from. And so we should probably change the name of Dundas Street in Toronto. But the idea that Dundas is a one-dimensional, like there are plenty of other one-dimensional villains in Canadian colonial history whose names have gone completely unrecognized and whose names are scattered all across the landscape here in Canada of like settler Canada. But I think Toronto wanted a share in a reckoning with race and slavery in the United States and in Britain, but the history of slavery in Canada is very different than the history of slavery in the United States. And so I think there's so many layers of complexity, and explaining them can sometimes be, it requires so much care to think about this stuff carefully, that I sometimes struggle to how to convey these messages and these ideas as something that is a set of action, a set of possible choices for action in the present.
I'm seeing another theme that I might want to pull out, Maria, because I'm remembering that there were actually a few questions about this, also very broad. With your historical sensibility, Padraic, any thoughts that you have about current discussions around reparations, right? And current discussions, especially given the way that you're asking us to think about anti-slavery, not just slavery, right? And, the payment to slaveholders and property owners, right? So about, compensation after, as a condition of abolition. So yes, I think there are a number of people who had some questions about where the current fight for reparations might fit within this. What does it mean to withdraw from the Commonwealth? What does it mean to make demands against the Bank of England? So any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think the moral case for reparations is ironclad, right? I think that there's absolutely no question, especially and in the context I know best, in the British context, right? The compensation fund that was paid to slaveholders was a fraction of the value of that had been produced by enslaved laborers, right? Like enslaved laborers made that land valuable and received nothing for it. And so, and in fact, there were even MPs who, were certainly not in the majority, but and people in the Anti-Slavery Society who made the point that, I don't think anybody plausibly thought that 20 million pounds should be paid out to formerly enslaved people. Although again, the moral case for that was, absolutely justified. But there were certainly MPs at the time who proposed, maybe there should be grants of land made to enslaved people. Maybe there should be like village services provided, you know what I mean? There were proposals that would have made emancipation meaningful, and an actual path to political and economic autonomy after emancipation, rather than the beginning of a equally fraught period in colonial history in the Caribbean, right? Of mounting conflict between white officials, a wealthy colonial elite, a growing colonial proletariat, right? Like the history of the labor history of the Caribbean after emancipation is very violent and very fraught. And the condition and its violence and fraughtness is largely because the economic damage done after emancipation was never repaired. That said, I'm glad I'm not a policy maker or a politician, because understanding that reparations are owed and figuring out how to deliver reparations, I think, are two very different questions. And so, I admire the push in the Caribbean for separation from for abandoning constitutional monarchy in favor of republicanism. I think that's admirable, and it says something about kind of severing the link between the empire and the colony. And but at the same time, right? I mean, who is the current hegemonic power in Caribbean politics? It's not Britain anymore, it's the United States. And so, and the idea that there are not other forms of colonial exploitation that are not rooted in mass enslavement, that would be erased by reparations is also not true, right? Like the relationship between like Jamaica or Cuba or Haiti or the Dominican Republic. I mean, those are not all former British colonies, but they're all in the U.S. sphere of influence, and they're all subject to the whims and vicissitudes of American economic and foreign policy. And so, you know, I applaud calls for reparations, but I'm glad that I'm not in a position of having to design how effectively to actually improve the lives of people whose like the conditions of their lives are shaped by the legacies of slavery, right? People living in like the sort of highly politicized and often very violent public housing projects in Kingston, right, that are closely affiliated with political parties, right? They're not living in those housing projects because of slavery, but the legacies of slavery underwrite economic inequality in the contemporary Caribbean, absolutely. So, but how, you know, suing the Bank of England, maybe that releases money, but how that money is spent is a very different kind of question, and one that I'm very much unqualified to comment on.
Padraic, you know, our series is on confronting racism around the globe. So we've been hearing from speakers in different countries about racism and discrimination in their countries. And I know today we've focused a good deal on the Caribbean, but I know you're also studying, your next book is going to be about Ireland. And I'm wondering if you had some thoughts about differences, distinctions, or similarities between how the people in the Caribbean and Kenya and Ireland were treated and are treated by the British Empire.
Sure. So I grew up in an Irish Catholic family with a lot of, especially older people in my family, for whom the idea that the Irish were enslaved was sacrosanct, which is not true, right? The Irish were not enslaved. They were never enslaved by the British Empire. I mean, there were enslaved Irish people in like the 9th century, like people were enslaved by the Vikings, but there's this myth among a certain tranche of the Irish diaspora that is, I think, kind of unseemly and rooted in a certain kind of racial anxiety, right? That I've seen, like certainly heard my relatives say, like the Irish were the first slaves, which is not true. So that's not the same. So I don't want to draw that narrative in. That's not, there were, and I think part of it comes from the fact that in the 17th century, during the British English Civil War, Irish soldiers were indentured in the Caribbean and were among the first plantation laborers in Barbados, but they were free at the end of their indenture and quickly became a part of the planter class after their indentures expired. So while they were indentured, the conditions of labor that they endured were identical to those endured by enslaved laborers, but at the end of their indenture, they were free, and so they could enjoy all of the benefits of their whiteness at the end of the period. So I think one of the distinctions with the Irish, at least, is that the Irish, when they're in, and I'm thinking about this is very germane, I'm just finished writing this chapter of Irish Question, or editing the chapter. So the Irish, when they were in Ireland, were absolutely an other to Britain. They were Catholic, they were strange, they were agrarian, but when they were in the empire, they were part of the labor force that made British imperialism possible. So I think that there's a sense in which there's a clear distinction there between the Irish and enslaved African laborers in the Caribbean. Although the comparison was made by the Irish in the 19th century, it was made also by British abolitionists between Irish laborers and enslaved laborers. But the comparison really became germane after emancipation, right? Because after emancipation, laborers in Ireland, also laborers in other colonies, laborers in the post-emancipation Caribbean, were all subject to the same basic principle, or what I take to be the same basic principle of civilization, which was that civilization was many things to many people. It shifted constantly over time, but one of its most static meanings was economic. And one of the most kind of tangible ways that someone could be civilized was by taking wages that were low enough to live, that were low enough that you would have to keep working, but high enough that you could survive. And that regime of very low wages and exploitation, colonial exploitation, especially of agricultural workers, was something that connected all of those various different spheres of British imperialism, right? Because the Irish, there were Irish prime ministers of the United Kingdom in the 19th century, or like the Duke of Wellington, right, was Anglo-Irish. So, and that certainly wasn't the case with the Caribbean or with Kenya. But at the same time, for agricultural laborers, the same set of ideas about taking wages as a way of proving your readiness for the next stage of civilization, and all of the kinds of exploitation and degradation that involved, that was a kind of universal principle, although it was applied very differently in different places, right? So the Irish, as I've said before, had all of the privileges of whiteness. That didn't mean that they weren't exploited by the British Empire, but it meant that their exploitation was very different in kind, and often very different in kind of ferocity than in the non-white colonized world. That's a huge question, though.
Okay.
And yeah.
So we'll have to have you back when this book comes out, after this book comes out. Michelle, did you want to take some of the questions about racism in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic institutes?
Sure.
I think there's a theme there, and about the Holmes Commission.
Sure. I mean, one of the things I was just thinking about, again, as you were talking about civilization, and then thinking earlier when you talked at more length about civilization, was Freud's civilization and its discontents, right? I think one of the challenges that psychoanalysis is facing now, which it hasn't completely internalized, right, is that the civilization that Freud is describing is the civilization that you are tracing, right? In a sense, one could say it's about a certain notion of whiteness and its discontents, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't structures of mind that are then also shaped by the global spread of that history, right? And so it's not just people who we would, phenotypically or stereotypically consider white who were shaped by that history. At some level, lots of different kinds of people were shaped by that history, right? But when he says civilization and its discontents, I think we are starting to develop a sharper realization that what had been, that your quote that I love so much that I referenced before, that the very move to define that as a universal experience was a part of the racializing project, right? And it was it may very well have reflected an experience, but it was an experience of a particular dominant type of subject, right? And so the rest of us now have to think about if we are not descended from those subjects, or if we're descended in lines of descent that are much more mixed and creolized and complicated, what is our relationship to the kind of structures of mind created by civilization and its discontents, when that notion of civilization is understood to be much more historically specific to a certain kind of imperial and colonial formation, right? So this is some of what I think, dialoguing with you and your work is I think why it's important for psychoanalysts to be thinking about, because it doesn't throw our concepts and terms out. It historicizes them and creates new ways of generating meaning about them, right? So that notion of Freud and civilization, that's certainly one thing that I was thinking about. You were nodding, Padraic, so I know I'm handling the psychoanalytic piece, but I don't know if you had some thoughts about that you were responding to as you were nodding.
No, that's super. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. No, please continue. I have a kind of summarizing thought, but
yes,
finish your.
Well, one of the things that I like about the Elizabeth Dillon essay that I mentioned before, and this is an essay that's in a collection called Psychoanalysis and History, so very relevant for the interdisciplinary dialogue that we're also engaging in here, is that one of her arguments about why we need to think about Freud's construction of the gender binary in relationship to histories of racial capitalism is that the notion of the family that Freud is working with, the Oedipal family, that is such a core structure of mind in the history and development of psychoanalysis, is itself constructed out of that history, right? And she talks about both Freud himself and his family, right? The involvement of his brothers in British textiles in Manchester, right? The development of the cotton industry that is shaping the boom in the textile industry in Manchester, where his brothers are living, one brother with whom he goes to live with, right? She kind of draws these connections in Freud's world and how his world was being shaped by this history, and how the notion of the family that he begins to think through and the structures and the way the family structures the mind are actually embedded within this history, right? And then there are other parts of the family that are developing in the colonies that this history is also meant to eradicate. And so she talks about the Black members of families, for example, in the colonies, be they nannies, be they, enslaved Black members of the families, right? Be they the people who are taking care of colonial children, European descended children, be they even just the enslaved that are living on the plantation, that the plantation system is itself a much broader matrix of family, right? That the Freud who is sitting in Vienna in the late 19th century is at some level dissociating, right? But his concept of family comes out of that history, right? So I just thought it was again, another example of how to try to put these histories in dialogue with the structures that we study so intensively in psychoanalysis, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to understand their historical specificity and how, if we believe in history and how returning to history makes new meaning for the individual, then it is also true that it means that something similar can happen for the field, right? I think some of this is how psychoanalytic institutes could incorporate some of this curriculum, right? Here's where maybe I'm more optimistic, Padraic, than you are in terms of what incorporating this into curricula can do, right? So in a psychoanalytic institute, finding sophisticated ways and sophisticated pieces that are out there and have been out there, also many written by Black psychoanalysts, right, that are linking these histories in how we think about the psychoanalytic subject and how we think about the person, right? Having curricula that actually help to start to draw some of those connections, I think will make a broader array of people feel like psychoanalysis has something useful to offer them. One of the earlier questions sent in asked something about how BIPOC people can navigate psychoanalysis and find it useful in this moment, given their sensitivities and awareness and experience of the implications and legacies of the very history that you describe, right? And so, yeah, I think a presentation like yours, I'm hoping, stimulates us to think about how to bring these conversations more into the way that the field develops, the psychoanalytic field develops from here.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt this very lively and rich conversation because we've reached the end of our time boundary here. But Padraic, did you want to summarize or say something?
Yeah, I'll just do it very briefly. We may be joined by my 1-year-old and 6-year-old in about a second because I can hear them outside the door. So they may make but I think that's a really good place to end, right? And I do think that there's the historian Thomas Holt argues in his book, argues in his work that we still live in the 19th century, and that our ideas about personhood and freedom and family, right, like what constitutes family, are shaped by that experience. And so I think that's, I think a simple but a profound insight, and one that is probably a good spot to end. And so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. This was really, really interesting. And I appreciate all of your questions, and Professor Stevens, I really appreciate you taking the lead on the conversation. And thanks very much.
Please, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you both, and I do hope that you'll come back again, Padraic and Michelle. And I would like to tell everyone that this event is recorded, and you can find it on the Institute's, William Allenson White Institute's YouTube channel. And also to let you know that our next event will be with the psychoanalyst M. Fauchery Davids. And Davids is an honorary consultant psychologist at the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis. And he's a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association's Home Commission for Racial Equality in American Psychoanalysis, and the author of Internal Racism, a Psychoanalytic Approach to Race and Differences. We don't have the date for that yet, but stay tuned. We will send out information very soon.
Oh, sorry, you can hear that. Thank you very much. You can hear the bell. That's the bell. All
It
right,
is
just one
so.
sec. Thank you very much,
All right.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.